All right. Well, thank you for the introduction. And I'm going to preface my talk today by saying a couple things. First, I'm not accustomed to being behind a podium. I'm used to roaming around. And so this might seem a little awkward, and I'll try to get through it. Hopefully you'll bear with me on that one. The second thing is I really like to emphasize that I wouldn't consider myself a forest health specialist. The fields that I tend to work in most are silviculture and ecology, both of which are strongly dependent upon what we know about forest health. And our understanding of forest health helps us to do the management, helps us to understand the ecology, helps us to be able to know what we want to try to do to get the forest that we'd like to have. But what I'm going to try to do today is provide really kind of more of a background, and I'll be honest with you, it's going to be a fairly superficial background because really you think about how broad the topic of forest health is, there's only so much that actually can be covered in even an hour-long talk. So don't be upset with me if I'm not touching upon your favorite forest health topic or I seem to have missed something. That's kind of not the point. The point is I'd like to kind of talk about one of the things that I do a lot of, which is kind of looking at the historical records and trying to figure out what was in the past and how that past can inform the present and then certainly help us manage for the future. And what I'm going to hopefully be able to do is give some of that context, show what we do know, what we don't know, what we'd like to know, and where I'd like to think this whole element is tending towards, and then to use that to set up some of the other speakers who will do a lot better job, I think, of touching upon some of the hot button topics. You know, a lot of the stuff that we're concerned about with forest health today, maybe not particularly relevant in the time span that I'm going to be looking at it in the past. You know, obviously, things like the emerald ash borer are only a recent issue to deal with. But a lot of the issues that we have been dealing with in the Western Gulf are really something they're things that have been around for a very long time. And so I think having a better appreciation for what was done in the past and how what we've done from a management standpoint or how we've interacted with the environment standpoint has really gone a long ways towards shaping what we're doing in management right now. So that's just kind of all context that we're looking at too. I think another reason why I was approached to do this is because I got lots of cool old pictures of forest. And it's one of the things I really like about the job that I do and look forward to doing here as well too. And is it possible to turn the lights down a little bit so some of these pictures? If not, it's not critical, but it might make some of them show up a little bit better too. But so this is one of the things I really look forward to doing is kind of digging through libraries and archives and old journals and other sources and finding these remaining elements that we have. Really in forestry, we've got this great visual legacy that's out there of the way things used to be. And so it's aesthetically pleasing. I mean, there's really some dramatic things to look at. But there's also, they're really spectacular tools to use as a researcher. For those of us that are interested in what things were like and how, you know, previous generations dealt with them and then maybe what that can tell us for how we can deal with them into the future, it's hard to pass up the opportunities that things like some of these historical photographs and historical accounts can provide for us. So this is what we tend to see of a lot of these. And you have to recognize that there are some inherent issues with using this stuff. There are inherent biases. I mean, in all honesty, how many of these pictures that are taken of the woods, especially those that end up being produced in like trade journals, these are coming out of things like American Lumberman and whatnot. But how many of these show kind of you know, a 30-year-old recently generated stand or, you know, a cut over landscape? That's not what they were trying to do at the time. They were trying to sell people on a product or advertise their timberlands, or, you know, they had a reason. And so they would go and they would pose in front of these posing trees in the best circumstances that they could find. Here you see we've got, let's see if I can get this pointer to show up here. So we've got a gentleman standing right here. This is some shortleaf loblolly timber in southern Arkansas, just outside of Huttig, Arkansas. And you can see the spectacular, the trees are going at, and you'll also have to apologize, let me apologize for, I've got a lot of Arkansas pictures because that's where I do most of my work, but I've got some other states mixed in here as well too, but forgive the Arkansas bias for now. So here we have a couple gentlemen, there's one standing right there, here's another one sitting in this tree right here. So this is cypress that was growing in Ashley County, Arkansas, which is only just a few hours from here. In the very early 20th century, it was a tremendous resource that was available, and they certainly worked into it and used it and went through it pretty highly. But if we look at these kind of pictures, we would look at it and say, man, our forests in the past, they were remarkably healthy. If you look, you don't really see any dead trees here. You don't see any other indications of major problems, but that's really by design. The photographers, the people that were putting these things together, weren't going out of their way to look for the issues that were there because that wasn't what their emphasis happened to be. That wasn't what they were interested in trying to portray to the people they were targeting with that stuff. So the reality is the truth is always more complicated, and you need to spend time looking at a lot of these examples, looking at a whole bunch of different images that are out there, reading through some of the accounts, trying to find those elements that you would recognize and note as significant of some of the forest health issues in the past. And when I'm talking forest health here, I'm going to talk about it in a very broad context. So we're going to look at things that range from fire, the wind disturbance, ice damage, some of the physical damages, as well as some of the biological ones, the biotic ones, so insects, diseases, that kind of stuff. So I'm going to be pretty encompassing. And part of the reason I'm doing that is because these, it's hard to talk about them in terms of a particular forest health issue in isolation. Typically one thing leads to another, and that gives us the forest health concerns we have on a large scale. So in this particular example here, I want you to focus, okay, so we've got this young lady and her mighty hatchet there, and you can tell she's ready to dig into the stand of timber just outside of Crossett, Arkansas. But what you really need to look is past the, what you're seeing in the front part here and the obviously posed character that's there to what we see in the background. So we see here we've got probably a fire scar. We've got some evidence of fire damage. And we can also glean that from the nature of the timber that we're looking at here as well. Notice how open the stand happens to be, how clear the understory is. Nowadays you couldn't find a stand of timber like this that didn't have a fire history that would look like this in this part of the world. The sites just wouldn't support that. You look at the undergrowth there, you see a grass and forb dominated community as opposed to a bunch of woody brush or pine seedlings or sweet gum or whatever else it would work out to be. And then you look at the hardwoods that are kind of mixed into here as well. Again, consistent with systems that were being burned on a regular basis. Okay, so these forest health issues can often sort of be a two-edged sword in that we have issues that can be damaging, but we also have issues that would sustain ecosystems. And so a lot of those of us in some of the public land use realms, we're actually looking to try to restore some of these things. We're looking to try to get things like open pine woodland communities back in a functional basis. Okay, so one person's forest health problem is another successful story. Oops. Just a different little picture. Also, now, so this one I think was from Texas, or no, it was Louisiana here too. Again, look at the trees there and kind of try to understand them for what they are representing here. So again, mature shortleaf and loblolly pine. If we look closely, though, we'll see evidence of physical damage, at least, probably also manifestations of decay that's showing up in here. You can see signs of red heart, other things going through. Again, signs of a living forest, a forest system that was not just wall-to-wall, beautiful timber, solid wood, and everything like that. A lot of the timber was left in the woods at this time period because it had too much decay, or it was too poor quality for what they were interested in. And this standing timber that they left behind sometimes is still with us in a biological legacy context. We still have a lot of very large and very old cypress in parts of the Southeast. But it's there because it's hollow as a drum and it had no value from a timber standpoint. And so that's why we still have it present on the landscape. It's not always easiest to determine or to see these forest health issues in historical literature. They didn't have the systems in place that we do today to document things that were happening. They didn't have the National Weather Service or other government agencies to note when ice storms would come through the world or through the areas and to document that. And so really, I mean, there would be newspaper accounts. There are accounts of some of these things that would show up. But typically, an event like this, which is pretty visually damaging, or looks pretty bad. Here's the same spot just a few months later. If it doesn't have a really permanent or impactful set of damages inflicted upon the timber there, it probably didn't get recorded. And so it's hard to really go back through the historical literature because it's so sparse to start out with. And then to figure out exactly the forest health issues that were involved and what they might have manifested themselves for and how they develop it. Some of the evidence is kind of indirect, and so what you have to do is make a best guess or take some inferences there. And once you're willing to look for that stuff, you can find it show up in a lot of different places. So I've kind of circled some of the elements of some of this stuff too. Again, not necessarily the most dramatic evidence of some forest health issues, but again, reflecting the notion that this stuff isn't the old timber that we see in these pictures isn't always as pristine as some of those photographs tend to make it out as. If you look closely, for example, on some of these logs, you can see that there was heart rot, there was decay, and other defects that would show up on it. Here's some red heart conch signs. You look into the timber in the background here, and it may not be terribly apparent at the scale, but this tree right here, again, reflects red heart. So we've got some disease that's showing up here too. And some of these stands had a very substantial component of that. Again, it doesn't always translate well into the literature. It doesn't always translate well into people's experiences because they were really targeting the stuff that had value, the stuff that was solid, that had the structural integrity they were looking for their products, and they largely ignored the rest of the materials that were out there. Really, if we want to go back far enough, we can look through the records and we can see, but we also have to recognize that a lot of this information just does not show up, is not available in the kind of context that we'd like to have it in, just because they weren't collecting it at the time, or there was no agency to try to find it or to search it out. And so really, in the late 1800s, some of the best, even though it's still pretty sparse, information we could find are in places like the census reports. Because they were the part of the government agencies that was actually out there kind of sort of collecting some of that information. And some of these early forestry reports that would come out through, so here's one from 1884, it was called the Report on Forestry, and it was one of a number of reports made to the U.S. Department of Agriculture. At the time, it wasn't even the Forest Service. Forest Service doesn't appear until some decades later, but it was kind of one of the predecessors, basically. And so this was really just some of the rudimentary information. And the way they collected it is it doesn't follow FIA. We don't follow those kind of protocols at this time. According to this one, and if you dig into this report, you can actually see it. They had this maybe 1 or 2 page questionnaire that somebody came up with, and they just mailed it to people, newspaper editors, local doctors, whoever they would come up with. And they didn't have a forestry staff to deal with. They didn't have state agencies to tie into. They didn't have, in many places, local universities that had people educated enough on the right topics to be able to say much. So they just sent it out to knowledgeable people. Some of these were sawmill owners. Some of these might have been large private landowners. We don't really know exactly what comes through. And they would put into these reports kind of a summary of what the people were telling them from the field. And so when you get these, again, it's some great information. These are little snippets out of this report from various counties and talking about different things. And so it's interesting, but it's also only tantalizingly close to what we really would kind of need to get a better sense for it. So if you look at, here's this first one here from Mississippi, talks about a number of things. Here's, a Panola County correspondent says a few years ago, a good deal of timber injury was sustained by the caterpillar. What caterpillar? What species of caterpillar? Is this one of the bagworms that we're accustomed to? A tent caterpillar? Is it something else? Is it something exotic? Is it something that has been there a long time? You'd like to think in 1884. A lot of these things would have been endemic pests that are still there, and we can kind of translate them through, but we don't know that. We don't necessarily know that. Even by the 1880s, a lot of stuff had been introduced to this country. And so you can't always tell by that, but it does give you a good sampling that, even at this time, people are recognizing that one forest health issue, a wind event, sometimes they call them hurricanes when they really meant tornadoes, but some of these things kind of trigger other things as well too. In this same report, it says a Burlington reporter says that some swamp white oak was killed this year by drought. Okay, again, another interesting thing to have there too. We can see that these forests were dynamic even back during this time period, if we could only get a little more information, boy, what a legacy we'd have with some of those things there as well too. So they talk about things like worms and caterpillars and stuff. It's a starting point. It's better than nothing, I suppose. Now, if you want to talk about an obscure outlet, if you ever have the chance to look back through the General Land Office survey notes, these can be spectacular resources to work with. Again, they're going to be kind of Spartan in some of those details, but you can find some very curious and very interesting things here too. So this is again from southern Arkansas here, and this was a surveyor that was working in the late 1820s, and so he was going through this area and he was doing his thing. He was marking out corners, noting the timber and stuff like that, and these are the typewritten transcriptions of his notes. And he came through an area. He said, timber on the north part scarce by windfall. And so that was a problem because they had to use witness trees to monument the corners that they were interested in, and he couldn't find it because of the wind damage that was out there. But notice there's an asterisk that follows that windfall there, and you read down towards the bottom there, and the comment here, put it in there by the surveyor, I learned that it is a pigeon roost. Okay, how many people have seen a pigeon roost before? Probably nobody, because the passenger pigeon that made these has been extinct for over a century. But at this time, back in the 1820s, we had billions of passenger pigeons out there. And they would roost into trees in kind of a nighttime communal setting. In quantities, in numbers enough, they would actually break the timber, full-size trees. The weight of the birds that were in these trees would be enough to break them down and to make it look like the surveyor thought. It was a wind throw event as opposed to a bunch of birds landing on the trees and crushing them. So talk about a forest health issue that we don't have to deal with today. I don't think we're worried about pigeon roosts as a concern for our forests nowadays. Some of the forest health issues that were always present and would get recognized might not have really been recognized to what they were doing to forests because really in a lot of this time span, people weren't that interested in what the forests were doing. They were more interested in things like how is this drought affecting my crops or my ability to transport goods via one of the main transportation systems like the rivers and such. That's what they were focused on much more so than what it was necessarily doing to the forest. And so what we're able to do with some of the techniques we can do nowadays is we can kind of look back and tie into that, and then maybe use this as one of several lines of evidence to go back and to try to figure out what this meant to the forest in the past and how that affected the human communities that were around them and involved with them. So I'm going to show you some snippets. This is from northern Louisiana. These are from the North American Drought Assessments or databases. And this is a tree ring-based set of chronologies, but it's tree ring based assessment of droughts over the last 2,000 years. And some of the data gets a little thin as you get back 1,000 years or more. But it's actually remarkably good and remarkably robust, and it gives you a good reflection. And it's for North America. You can get this across this nation. I'm just going to show you one from northern Louisiana, but it really gives you a sense for what things had been like in the past, and we can use that to kind of think about things, how we're seeing them in the present, and what that would have translated to. So here's this chronology for this North America, this northern Louisiana grid point here. Now, it doesn't go back, itself isn't far enough back to go back to 2,000 years. The blue line here is the number of chronologies that were available to do this, and notice that after about 400 or 500 years, they really start to drop off in their numbers. But they still had them going back to really about 1,000 AD. So this goes back about 1,000 years reasonably well. On the right side here, I've highlighted, on my right, I guess that's your right too, but I've highlighted some of the major droughts that we know of, because in some cases people have lived through them that are in this room. Other cases we've got really good documentation of these things. So the Dust Bowl drought, you can see how that impacted this little kind of departure right here. Not every year was a drought, but there were some. Between 1952 and 1964, there was a pretty extensive period of drought and high heat. Again, not every year happened to be a drought year, but it collectively can be kind of thought of as 10 or 12 years worth of pretty dry conditions. Look at over time some of the droughts that had happened out there. So let me try to tie this into something else too. So I'm sure most people remember the 2011 drought, how bad things were. We lost a lot of timber. There was a lot of tree, especially in Texas. There was a lot of tree mortality. I remember seeing some in southwestern Arkansas. I'm sure northwestern Louisiana had some as well, in Oklahoma. And so you think about that. That was a pretty significant drought for really a year or two. And this PDSI it's Palmer Drought Severity Index. It's a way they calculate a drought, and they can tie that into these tree rings. And the more negative you are, the stronger, the more severe the drought happens to be. And I don't remember exactly what the PDSI is. The colors on this particular map I'm showing down here don't reflect or tie into that PDSI value like they do in some of the other things I'm going to show. And the drought monitor little picture on the bottom is also not necessarily a reflection of that. But just keeping in mind that this PDSI for these are probably -2 or -3, something in that range. Comparable to the droughts we would have seen in the 1950s and some of the Dust Bowl droughts as well too. But look down the chronology and kind of come back through time here and see what some of the other ones that are showing up as. Okay, so here's a tree ring reconstructed drought that affected really most of the southeastern and some of the southwestern United States and even some parts of the northern Great Plains. In the year 1125, isn't it kind of cool? They can actually, because we've got tree rings, we can actually tie it back to a specific year, not just a range of years, but this is what the records show us for that year. And I chose this particular year in part because it seems to correspond reasonably well to the drought pattern we saw in 2011. Now, I'm not going to necessarily vouch for, these are approximations of PDSI based on what the tree rings are telling them. You get a reasonable sense for it. The grid cells are fairly large. There are some of those issues there too. But notice the general pattern. East Texas was really kind of some of the worst of it in this area, but it was widespread. It was southeastern wide, and it was pretty substantial. So translate that up to the whole assessment of the chronologies up there. This little microphone keeps popping away on us here. And notice not just the one-year drought that we were looking at there. Notice the context that it comes into. So this year 1125 drought, which was pretty bad. I mean, it got in northern Louisiana between -2 and -3, which is a pretty bad drought. That was only 1 year of basically 20 years of that kind of drought. Now, you remember how bad it was in 2011, how much timber we lost, what kind of issues we had with fire and other forest health issues in just 1 year of that kind of drought. Imagine that for 20 years. And that's about what we had in the year 1125. And then it seems like a little bit later, okay, so we had a pretty wet year. It's kind of blocked by some of these arrows. So we had like basically 1 year where precipitation kind of went even a little above normal. Maybe they had a hurricane pass through or something like that. And then it dropped back into another cycle of this drought for another 20 or 25 or maybe even 30 years. So just picture that, about 50 years of drought as bad as 2011. And you can imagine what some of the issues, the prehistoric peoples would have had to deal with in that time span in those locations. Fire, which of course would have been one of the biggest ones. And you look through the records and what a lot of people talking about forest health during this time span were focusing on, really they focused on just a handful of things. Things like fire, which to them was obvious and destructive because it would tend to destroy one of the few things they really thought was worthwhile out of the forest, and that was the timber value that happened to be there. In many ways, this didn't break a lot of people's hearts because they just wanted to get rid of the timber anyhow. They wanted to put in farms or pasture, cleared for crops. The forests were an impediment more than anything. So you would see a lot of that, the notes of the damaging fires there too. There was also some recognition that really at this time period, I think you can argue that it's still the case, but the people were really one of the big forest health issues to try to sort out in a lot of these locations. And so it really, and the practices they were identifying as problematic were some that they looked at as particularly destructive to the timber that happened to be out there. So as we can see up here in this picture, this is a turpentining operation. Which is they're not killing the trees. They've been using these for quite a while, but they're certainly damaging the timber that's there. Eventually, it causes problems, and certainly, if you get a fire into those cat faces, you're going to lose a lot of that timber as it goes up there. That's a highly flammable resource. But we also saw a lot of people kind of complaining about the homesteading practices that were going on. So you think about most of the 19th century, the federal government in particular, but state governments as well, they're trying to get people to settle the landscape. They're trying to get people out there clearing the timber and farming, and they're not worried about trying to support a timber industry. They're worried about really trying to support farmers and other types of agriculture that they wanted to put out there. And so again, the trees were an obstacle to get rid of. And so some of the homesteading practices were really very destructive of the timber. They would girdle the trees, they would burn the trees, they would just damage the timber without concern for trying to recover any of the wood value that might have happened to be there. Because really for these homesteaders, they were required to improve the properties that they were acquiring as a part of these homesteading claims. And improvement meant clearing and putting in farms, putting in homes, barns, whatever. That was improvement. Managing the timber, of course, at that time was not even considered that. So they would go in a lot of areas, they would kind of knock the timber back, damage it, maybe grow a crop or two, and then move on. That's just the way it was done. And that ended up destroying huge quantities of forest. And of course, a lot of these kind of practices would end up leading to to what was recognized even at that time as bad outcomes, bad results. Here we can see a person standing in a gully formed by erosion of highly erodible soil type. And so they would recognize that there were some of these problems, and fairly early on, there were attempts to try to correct some of these things, and certainly early in the 20th century, as we went through things like the Dust Bowl, and we saw large numbers of displaced persons in this country because of farming failures and other kind of problems that were coming up there. People recognized, okay, let's do what we can to try to fix the problems. And they fixed them the best way they thought possible. And in some places they were planting trees, but other places they were looking for what seemed more intuitive or logical corrections to it. And so that's kind of where we see things like kudzu coming into the world. So kudzu was brought in part as an ornamental species. It's for some people an appealing thing to look at. But really it was promoted for quite a while to solve some of these problems. It does a very effective job of what you see doing here and what would have fixed the other thing. It helps to stabilize the land surface. It helps to keep it from eroding out. It was done kind of without consequence or without thought about what that might translate to for the rest of the environment. You know, there are definitely places where there are major stability issues, and this had a role to fix it. But you know, the kudzu doesn't know to stop at the edge of that ravine and not to go anywhere beyond that. You know, the kudzu is just going to be what kudzu is, and it's a, you know, it's a creeping vine that covers everything possible, as do a number of other of this kind of stuff. So they're very effective at providing ground cover. Unfortunately, they're also very effective at invading areas, adjacent forests, and causing other problems. But what we see happening by the early 20th century are people are kind of changing their perspectives, and they're recognizing that we need to do things to protect the forest. They recognize the value of the forest, and forest and forestry actually became meaningful things to do. They weren't just accidental things you work through in order to clear the land to put crops out there, or to clear the land for other kinds of development. There was value in having forest, and foresters were able to show people that there's ways we can grow the timber better, we can manage the land better, and so we really, and by the mid-20th century, became very interested in the forest and making sure things were done right. And so what we see are sort of a change in how these forest health issues are kind of perceived and approached and you know, realized out there in the landscape. By the 1930s, 1940s, maybe a little bit later, what we really got was effective fire control across much of the South, and in other parts of the country as well too. Systems of fire towers, of suppression policies and practices, of other effective tools to be able to kind of control the fires there. And really what I think did as much as anything, and probably the most thing, is we educated the population about problems that came with fires, that it wasn't just a tool to, or you know, to try to clear the land, but there were problems, and we needed to be careful about that. And so we actually got good enough with it that people came back to the notion of, you know, we can actually use it as a tool for silviculture. You know, as we transitioned and we started trying to grow the stands, and we realized we're going to have some problems with some of the other tree species out there outside of the ones we really desired for some of the crop things that we were interested in, forest crops. And so we started using fire as a tool, and this, of course, is before we really got a lot of effective herbicides and other effective competition control systems out there. And, you know, fire had worked in the past, and certainly has abilities to work in the present as well, too, in the future. You know, once the general population really embraced the notion that timber was something of value, that there was profit to be made from the forest, and things could be lucrative from that standpoint, we started seeing a lot of changes. We intensified the management. We continued to learn from how things were done in the past, and we came up with new and better ways to make that a profitable venture. And so obviously what we see starting about the mid-20th century and really ramping up into the latter decades of it was the advent of widespread pine silviculture using increasingly intensively managed plantations. And we've gotten very good at doing this. We've really developed the systems. We know in many ways, in many places, the best ways to be very productive. But of course, this is changing a system that had kind of, I don't want to say it had a balance or a dynamic, but had a set of constituents to it that, you know, tended to sometimes or frequently respond also very positively to the changes that we were making. And it, again, this is kind of a learning cycle that's going through here. So we would go ahead and we would try something, a problem would arise, we'd figure out a fix for that problem, we'd continue to try it, a different problem would arise, we'd kind of go through some of those cycles. And I think we've really made a lot of great advances, but we do have to recognize that they do sometimes come at a cost and come at new challenges that we didn't anticipate before. So again, just kind of as an example, not saying that this is the only example that's out there, or perhaps the best example, but it's a convenient one as well too. So we have issues with fusiform that really we never really thought much of. I mean, fusiform is an endemic forest disease. It's been out there, ever since people have been out there. It really only becomes an issue when you have large-scale areas that are being managed intensively, especially plantations, and you have susceptible planting stock that's out there and the right set of conditions for that planting stock to get infected with it. And in the early decades of the plantation movement and tree improvement, it took us a while to recognize how this was going to be a problem. And so there was a lot of concern for quite a while that this kind of intensive silviculture was not going to pan out because of problems that would arise from things like fusiform and some of the other pests and diseases that happen to be out there. But so we do what we always do. We decided we were going to study this. We're going to try to learn about this and try to adapt from some of the challenges or the mistakes we may have been making. And so we really studied it closely. We recognized that there were geographic patterns involved with the fusiform occurrence. We understood the disease cycle a lot better over time. We understood the pathogen and the alternate hosts and the environmental circumstances that favored it. And I think really most importantly, we started recognizing that there were places where fusiform was a major problem for everything that seemed to be out there, and some things seemed to do pretty well. And we started recognizing that there's a strong genetic connection within the trees that we were planting out there, and that some families were much less susceptible to fusiform, and some species as a whole were less susceptible to fusiform. Loblolly pine shows it was fairly susceptible initially. And then we started recognizing that we could address that with some of that, and so we could see some of these successes over time now. Obviously the key, the easiest measure of success, or a way we knew that we kind of address the problem is we've kept planting loblolly pine out there. We're not doing so much slash pine anymore because we haven't really addressed that as thoroughly. But loblolly we have, and so the graph I'm showing up here at the top is from a recent publication. And you could see, so the blue bars represent the proportion of fusiform in loblolly pines in the 1970s or 1980s, and the green is more recent decade, 2010s. And if you look across the board, some states obviously are more affected than others. Georgia, Louisiana, South Carolina, and Alabama had pretty high incidences of fusiform. But what we're seeing across the board right now is generally pretty dramatic reductions. Not every state, because some states weren't really that high to start out with. But generally, the trend has been a downward one. And that's because we quickly recognized that we could control the genetics of loblolly pine to deal with fusiform rust. And that worked its way into the genetic stock that was being planted, and it was remarkably successful. Some other forest health issues have kind of waxed and waned over time, and so I think we're in this case I'm going to talk about the southern pine beetle. We're kind of in a bit one of these lulls right now, and it kind of can lead to a little bit of complacency, but it really was again another endemic species, another forest pest that was always out there. But until we changed the forest conditions to make the habitat much more favorable over a large scale for the southern pine beetle, it'd be a localized issue. It wouldn't be kind of the regional issue that it became for a while there. And in all honesty, I mean, so I've been, granted, it's not a huge amount of time, but 17 years in the South. And I remember when I first came down here, how many people would be also concerned about southern pine beetle and its thing really to focus on, and you know, we've just not seen huge problems. There have been regional outbreaks. There have been issues. When I first came down here, parts of Kentucky and Tennessee and other parts of that region, it had a pretty substantial southern pine beetle outbreak. And it pops up periodically. But a lot of people, especially a lot of young foresters nowadays and people that have even been practicing for a while, you know, don't really have a good sense for what a southern pine beetle outbreak can be like and how extensive it can be and how damaging it can be. And so from that standpoint, it's still worthwhile to go back into the records. And now with southern pine beetle, this was recognized as a problem fairly early in the middle part of the 20th century. And so we made a really concerted effort to deal with it and monitor it and track it. You know, this was something we couldn't do a century beforehand because we didn't have the expertise, we didn't have the staff, we didn't have the people out there trying to deal with this stuff. But we did by starting in the mid 20th century, and so it's very interesting to me to look at this and kind of think about this in terms of how the dynamics changed with this over time. Let's see if I can get this to work. So this is a compilation I picked up off the internet. If I can get it to go. Oh, no. It's basically an animation. I'm not very good with this mouse here. It said it was going to do it. Let's see if it does it. Anyhow, what the animation was intending to show here is the. I'm not really sure. It's slowly pulling the video up. But what it does is it shows the waxing and the waning, the changing of the extent of the infestation of southern pine beetle across the region over time. And it was working earlier today, so we'll see if this is. Well, it's loading the video up. I can see the thing going across there.
That should be playing it. Let's go backwards.
Yeah,
And then forwards. I'll try it. Click the bottom part here.
See?
To use your imagination.
You'll just have to use your imagination. So the interesting thing is, for the first number of years of this animation, you know, you would see these little splotches and patches flaring up here and there, you know, in poor southeastern Texas. It almost always in southeastern Texas. But it, you know, just kind of flaring up a little bit. And eventually what ends up happening is you get larger patches. You get larger areas that are showing up. And that's really a reflection of how extensive the you know, how successful and extensive the pine silviculture had gotten across the area. Of course, these are in largely natural stands. There were some plantations, but we had a lot of forests at that time period with how we were managing them that they're carrying a lot of basal area in trees that were of pretty good size. And so they really made a lot of favorable conditions for that southern pine beetle to really get going. And once it got going, it really got going, and it took off and hit large areas and pretty extensively. Anyhow, you can go to that website. You can actually watch the animation as it does its thing. Unfortunately, it only goes from 1960 to 1996. And so you don't get to see the last 20 years, which would be another interesting thing to be able to see, because I think what we'd see is kind of a notable paring down in most places of the outbreaks of the southern pine beetle. Again, as we adapted ourselves, as we adapted our silvicultural systems to make them less susceptible to have stand conditions that are less favorable for the southern pine beetle, we've seen some of those changes. Now, put it into context. Let's think about things like what happens if we lose a lot of the pine timber markets and we're carrying basal areas that are higher than what they need to be because we can't do those thinnings, or letting stands get bigger and be in that vulnerable stage for a lot longer. We could find ourselves falling back into some of those historical outbreak conditions where we're seeing widespread issues, and how do we deal with that? And so I've done some work in ice storms. Ice storms, again, are another thing that's been out there, that's always been out there. The mechanics behind it are such that certain tree size classes tend to be a lot more vulnerable than others. And in the old days, in the past, in the history, we had a lot of larger trees, and patches of smaller trees, but we had mature forest. Mature forests aren't particularly susceptible to ice storms. They can bear the ice loads. You'll get some branch or crown damage. If you have the right kind of soil moisture conditions and wind conditions, you can see some bigger trees get thrown over. But for the most part, it's not a huge problem. As we've changed the silvicultural landscapes of the southeastern United States, the West Gulf Coast just as well as the East, we're not letting the trees get as big. We're managing younger stands. We're thinning them at a point in time that really leaves them fairly vulnerable to things like ice storms. And we end up having problems like this. This was an ice storm that struck in central Arkansas just a few years ago. And it really starts to become an issue. It had been recently thinned. It was at an age class and a stage where it's very vulnerable to this kind of event. And you can see the damage that happened. And this wasn't a very bad ice storm in terms of ice accumulation. It wasn't a huge amount of icing that had happened here, but you can see the extent of the damage that happened there too. And so where this really becomes a big concern to landowners, the more money you've invested in the stand, the less you like to see these kind of events coming through. When you're not putting money into those stands, having this kind of come through, it sets the stand back, but it's not taking money out of your pocket. But when you've had a lot of money to get the plantation established and to maintain it and encourage its growth over time, to lose a lot of that. And the reality is some people can salvage this. Some people have the opportunity, the luxury, if you will, of being able to get this downed and damaged material before it goes bad, but a lot of landowners can't. And so that's when that really becomes a significant forest health issue. And of course, all this dead timber leads to potential for other health issues to flare up. Insect outbreaks, fire risk, those kind of challenges. Now, I've focused really a lot on the pines because we're a pine silviculture unit, so I got a lot of good examples of that. Obviously, hardwoods are not immune to forest health threats as well, too. And so I just kind of just to throw in a few examples there. Again, a lot of the issues that affect the conifers affect the hardwoods in similar fashions, and so a lot of the notions can be put into that. We've done a lot less across the southeast regarding hardwood silviculture and improvements and stuff like that. So it's a little bit, it has a little bit different approach or nature to it. But so these are some of the chestnuts that are historically would have been found out there. And of course, I think every forester well knows the story of the chestnut blight, how it was introduced in the early 20th century in kind of the New York area, came over on shipments, and spread remarkably quickly across a wide area. And of course, it was going through very favorable countryside. The American chestnut areas that we would have across, especially the Appalachian Mountains, had a lot of chestnut. Many of which were at some degree of stress involved with them as well too. And so you could see how rapidly it progressed. Now, we didn't have chestnut on this side of the Mississippi River, but we had chinkapins, and they're very closely related. And so we had the same effects of that then. So a lot of the chinkapin that used to be a fairly significant component of some forests and locally, a food crop, if you will. People would get the chinkapin nuts. They're out of luck because the chinkapin is largely gone now as well too. So this isn't from the southeastern United States, but this again is just another example, one that I was a little more familiar with coming up from the northern lake states, where we did have quite a bit more elm in this kind of urban context. But elm was a spectacular tree, very beautiful in form. It got very large. It was a very popular urban planting. It was commonly found in a lot of communities, almost exclusively in a lot of communities. It was really a sight to behold. And then the Dutch elm disease showed up. and then spread across there. And many communities learned, well, we thought they learned a lesson, maybe they haven't, but about the problems of having such a monoculture of such a species that's vulnerable to something like this. And so a lot of places lost all the elms and went from, what you see here to basically a bunch of kind of open lots again. And so they had to put things in. Now, where I said they learned the lesson, I unfortunately don't think we learned enough of the right kind of lessons. In that we saw a lot of people going back to that practice of planting more monocultures. And in some places, it was ash that they used to put out there. So my wife's family is from southeastern Michigan. And that's, of course, the epicenter where the emerald ash borer came out of. And so for the last 20 years, as we've gone back to visit her family, we've watched the ash trees die in southeastern Michigan. And the killing front spreading out in all directions. And nowadays, as we drive back and forth from Arkansas to Michigan or up to my parents' place in Wisconsin where they also have it, we increasingly see along a lot of the roads the dead ash trees in places like Ohio, in Illinois, Indiana. And unfortunately, it will now be Arkansas and Louisiana and Texas and everybody else. I'm not particularly optimistic we're going to deal with that issue, but prove me wrong. Let's hope we can. There are other things that have come out that are noticeable, and the speakers will have some of this, deal with some of this as well too, in the more contemporary thing. Things like dogwood anthracnose. A lot of times with hardwoods, since they're not necessarily as a major timber component, we tend to notice disease problems when they start taking out the things we think are aesthetically pleasing. Things like dogwoods that are noticeable when they're not there in the woods. I don't want to make the point that only problems we have to worry about are exotic, introduced diseases and insects. There are plenty of endemic ones that are around there in both hardwoods and conifers as well, and lead to problems. So really what I'm hoping that this was able to do is to give you a sense for the notion that these forest health issues have always been with us. We've had to learn to deal with them differently. They've manifested themselves differently. Things have changed over time, and so that things do end up, we have these great pictures from the past, and we can learn a lot from these. They don't always tell the most obvious of stories, and so sometimes what we have to do is we have to learn how to read that story, the forest health story, from these, and use that to inform our things nowadays. But I also want to make sure to emphasize this notion: knowing the past is extremely helpful, but it isn't necessarily a blueprint for how things are going to translate into the future. It helps for planning, it helps for anticipation, but we also have to recognize that the reality, things are changing. The environment is changing, conditions are changing, the climate has been changing, how we're managing, where we're putting trees has changed, and we're starting to see some of these forest health issues changing as well. Even the ones that have been around for a long time, that we thought we had a pretty good handle on, you can't always expect them to behave now and into the future like they did in the past. And so I'm hoping that this is just an aberration and not a trend of something to happen, but this is something that was noticed recently in parts of eastern Oklahoma and western Arkansas, where we're seeing on some of these off-site loblolly pine plantations, all of a sudden there are these Ips beetle outbreaks that are acting like southern pine beetle outbreaks. And so instead of being very localized and limited in their spread and extent, it's widespread loss and damage that are coming from these. Ips beetles are not known for this kind of behavior, unlike the southern pine beetle. But you can't treat the damage from Ips beetles the same way you treat the damage from southern pine beetles. So if this becomes the next major insect-based forest pest issue for a lot of that area, a lot of the southeastern United States, we're going to have to come up with a whole new system of how to deal with it and how to manage for that and treat the realities that are out there. So I don't want to end this on absolute doom and gloom. What I would like to emphasize is there are resources out there for people. This is just a partial list. You'll get plenty of that over the next day and a half or so. There are a lot of people that are looking at this. The internet is a great source of information for a lot of this material. And again, this is just a partial list here. But there are people looking at these things. We're developing new tools that are going to be possible. And some of these tools are increasingly almost real-time things. I didn't emphasize it too much, but one of the things my agency is working on is this forewarn website, where it's really tying in some of the satellite imagery, where not quite real time yet, but very shortly thereafter, as soon as they can process some of the images, you could see things. And so they've mapped out things like, ice storm damage in places, and insect outbreaks, and fires, and drought impacts, and all that kind of stuff. And we're increasingly going to have those tools available to us. And so maybe that'll be how we deal with some of these forest health issues into the future. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions you may have.
Thanks, Todd.
Shouldn't have time for questions. Okay, yes.
Across the West, a lot of ranger districts, specifically in Montana, have over the last 100 years taken pictures of the same site. It just seems like every ranger district ought to be doing that.
And I think a lot of places have, maybe not specifically to watch how the forests are changing, but just out of conventional practices. We have a limited amount of those at our CrossFit Experimental Forest. And other places things are doing. And really, I would encourage people, if you have those, and I bet you a lot of you have more than you think buried away in a dusty old file cabinet somewhere, try to share those out there. The Forest History Society actually has a repeat photography website, and they are actively looking for people to send in scanned versions, especially those that have good information on them, of repeat photography examples. I've sent a few pictures from the cross that they really want more examples out there. So if you have them, look them up, and I forget the name of the exact website there too. But it's a great tool to get a sense for how the forests have changed in these places. Yeah, and how we expect them to kind of continue to change. So good one there. I'll also say that one of the things we've set up with the Journal of Forestry is we have this Picture of the Past article series now too. So I'll put a shameless plug in for this. If you have some of these great old historical images and you kind of know something about them, send them on in. We're looking for more materials. We'd love to share that with the rest of the SAF membership, and I'm happy to work with people to make that happen. Yes, Doug.
Seems like I read, you referenced GLO, seems like I read one time where in North Arkansas, someone was doing, in the 1830s, 40s, surveys from an office, and it became controversial. How reliable are the GLO reports?
So the question is, how reliable are the GLO reports for these kind of things? And we don't know. So that's there are some places and some persons that we do know in the GLO that are notoriously unreliable. And so the case that Doug is referring to here was a surveyor, a very well-connected surveyor. His brother actually was a surveyor general for the state of Arkansas for a while. And we don't really know the extent of the fraud that he might have perpetrated. But he was even known back in the 1800s for not doing the best of jobs. And they resurveyed a fair number of his original surveys. But they didn't get them all, and so some of those were still part of that. So like a lot of this information, you do have to take it with a grain of salt. You do have to kind of recognize the strengths and the weaknesses. The information I shared with you there, nothing struck me as out of the ordinary. So I don't think that there was any problems with that. But in other places, North Arkansas is unfortunately one of those. That there are some challenges with that, and you just have to know the information a little bit and recognize that it wasn't collected initially with the intent of being a forest inventory or an ecological survey. And the people that were collecting that information, that were recording it, aren't trained in the same fashion that we happen to be. So, again, you balance it out and you work with what you can. And there's a remarkable amount of good information there, but there's some that is dubious. So, all right, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Tom.